Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Pete Klenow, who is Professor of Economic Policy in School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford University. He is also Senior Fellow, Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I want to start with one of your papers from 2016 to sort of set the context for our larger conversation. And that paper is entitled Beyond GDP, Welfare Across Countries and Time. You say we propose a summary statistic for the economic well-being of people in a country. Our measure incorporates consumption, leisure, mortality, and inequality. First for a narrow set of countries using detailed microdata, and then more broadly using multi-country data sets. But one of the issues I see, Pete, when economists talk to the public, when we use terms like utility and welfare, sometimes those terms sound too technical, too abstract for people to really connect with. So you have a quantitative measure here to get to it. So more generally, what do you mean by welfare?
Yeah, so we like to look at what people are willing to pay in terms of consumption that they sacrifice in order to, say, try to live longer or enjoy more leisure time. So utility is just our way of saying, what people are trying to get out of consumption, leisure, living a long life. But utils are meaningless. Like there's no units called utils that we care about. So that's why in this Beyond GDP paper, we convert everything into consumption equivalents, meaning like, how much sacrifice to consumption per year in percent would you be willing to endure in order to live another year of your life? And of course, it matters, what your quality of life would be in terms of health in that year. But so utils are kind of just a conceptual thing, like people are trying to enjoy some combined satisfaction from consumption, leisure, and living a long life, and broader things that economists find it harder to measure, things like the quality of our relationships and the quality of the natural environment. Those would be an even broader measure of welfare or utility. But we're always trying to convert things into units we can understand and measure, like consumption equivalents. That helps.
Yeah. So those four factors, consumption, leisure, mortality, and inequality, when somebody considers those factors, there are some trade-off decisions there, right?
Right. So people are constantly choosing, whether to take, a job that involves more hours but involves more pay. So they're trading off some leisure time for some consumption. So we use estimates of how much people are willing to make that trade-off. Use terms like the elasticity of labor supply. So meaning how willing people are to sacrifice leisure for consumption. And of course, the more consumption they have, the less they're willing to sacrifice more leisure. So the trade-off isn't a fixed one. There's, if people have a bunch of wealth already and enjoy a high quality of life, they might not be as willing to work really long hours. So we really want to take into account evidence on how people make that trade-off, how much they need to be rewarded in terms of high wages, for example, to temporarily work more. So using estimates of things like temporarily high wage opportunities, how much longer will people work? That's critical for us thinking about how to measure the value of, say, declining leisure over time. So in the United States, leisure time is, depending on how you measure it, has declined. Market work has gone up, say, over recent decades. Converting that into a consumption loss, we really need to know how people make that trade-off. So we use that kind of evidence to make the trade-off, to quantify the trade-off.
Okay. And so at the country level, obviously that trade-off is a function of culture. It's a function of, sort of the objective function of the people, right? So they may have different values, I would imagine, for consumption leisure based on the country's culture.
That's a tough one for economists to, grapple with. I mean, we tend to say people are people everywhere, and
Yeah.
the kind of like fundamentals of preferences are the same everywhere. Kind of like we say the distribution of talent is the same, everywhere. But sociologists would certainly disagree with us and say there is something, known as culture that forms people's preferences and behaviors, social norms. I'm not a sociologist, so I can't advocate that as effectively as they can. But one of the things we're doing is we're saying, it's true people in France may enjoy leisure more than people in the United States. But what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's take a common yardstick. Let's say we'll take estimates from the United States about how much people are willing to trade off consumption and leisure. And then say, from the point of view of the person with those preferences, if they were living in France versus the United States, where would their consumption equivalent welfare be higher? So I give the France example because in terms of consumption, it looks like they have like 60% of the consumption of the United States. So it looks like they're worse off if they have the exact same preferences, even. But their leisure is higher, their life expectancy is higher, and there's less inequality. So average, welfare can be significantly higher. We estimate over 90% of the U.S. level, despite the fact that the measured market consumption is 40% lower than the United States. If we, to get to your question though, which is, what if people in France have enjoyed leisure more? Then the gap looks even smaller, and maybe welfare is even higher in France because they have a lot more leisure. They have hundreds of hours more leisure time per year per person. So if putting more weight on leisure, if they prefer that, they would look even better compared to the United States than this big increase that we've estimated, even using U.S. preferences.
Okay. So in the paper, you're basically considering, like you say, a person is a person, and there are these three factors. So in the case of France, if I understand this correctly, Pete, their consumption is lower, a lot lower than the US, but their lifespan and inequality measures basically bring the welfare up. How far up does it come from 60% down from a consumption perspective?
Yeah, like over 90% equivalent. And it's about 10 percentage points of that comes from having a couple years longer life expectancy. About 10% of that comes from having hundreds of hours a year more of leisure time per person. And the remaining 10%, the inequality, it's important for me to emphasize, the way we quantify it is not taking into account like interpersonal considerations, like which may be there, which may be very valid, which is like maybe people don't like to live in an unequal society, just to be around poverty. They don't want to see people suffering. That would certainly be good if people had those preferences, but we're not incorporating those in this particular estimate. The estimate we have is to try to be broader than GDP, but it's not, a perfect measure of welfare. So the inequality that we have in mind is actually, it's kind of Rawlsian, meaning the philosopher Rawls saying behind some veil, if you didn't know whether you're going to be poor or rich, the United States looks pretty unequal. So it's a riskier thing to be born into the United States where you don't know whether you're going to be rich or poor than in France, where the gap between the rich and the poor is smaller. So that extra risk they're facing in the United States, we estimate is lowering average happiness on the order of 10%. So that's where we get to, they start at 60% of US consumption, they vault to higher than 90%, taking into account these three factors.
And France is likely a good proxy for most of the Western European countries, I would imagine.
Yeah, exactly. So Scandinavia inequality is much lower throughout Western Europe. Life expectancy is higher in the United States, and hours worked are significantly lower in Western Europe than the United States. Exactly.
So you're assuming here that inequality creates sort of a risk for an individual, and if inequality is higher, that risk is higher, and correspondingly welfare is lower. But how do you quantify, from a how do you kind of bring it to a number in terms of welfare?
Well, similar to what I was saying, we look at behavior about how people trade off consumption and leisure in their decisions. We can make
Yeah.
estimates of how much people are willing to take risk. So, like risky jobs or occupations versus less risky ones, and that could be in terms of the stability of their wages, and it could be in terms of even health risks that they face in certain occupations. So, we use estimates of how risk averse people are to say behind the veil, how costly is it? How much, and if I can use utility terms, we're saying diminishing margin utility. So if there's a big gap between rich and poor, that's going to lower your average utility. But we want to say, just like I was saying before, we want to say how much are you willing to lower your average consumption to avoid that risk. So then we can say, look, people are willing to earn lower returns for safer bonds than for riskier stocks. That gap has information about how people are willing to make risk return trade-offs.
Okay. And lifespan is another complicated thing, especially that you have to bring in quality of life, end of life issues. This is increasingly a problem for Western countries. That increase in lifespan doesn't necessarily correlate with quality of life, right?
Right. So you're saying, the quality of life isn't the same across all years. So you're saying things like
Yeah.
maybe like when you're 80, you might not be as healthy, or let me do personally. When I'm 56, I'm not as healthy as I was when I was 20. I can't play sports in the same way, as much as I would like to. So we're not claiming that quality of life in the sense of health is the same at all ages, but the way we measure it though, we're basically taking evidence that when some countries have higher life expectancy, they tend to increase the quality of life at all years. In other words, like one simple way to say it was imagine that the last year of your life, it's going to be a much lower quality year. That's a simplistic way to view the world, but imagine it's the same quality every year, but the last year is really bad. If you lengthen your life by 1 year, there's still that bad year at the end, but you have another quality year before that. So that's a simplistic version. We don't assume that, but that's the flavor of it. We're saying when you increase life expectancy by 2 years, you might increase the number of quality years closer to 2 years than zero. Just even though the last years of your life may not be the same quality as earlier younger years.
Okay. Okay. So, a lot of times GDP is used to measure a country's position. In this analysis, is GDP is still fairly highly correlated with welfare, or that relationship sort of goes away?
Yeah, the correlation is very strong, positive. And that's because of the factors that I was describing. Consumption differs so much across countries compared to differences in leisure and even differences in life expectancy. Now, the thing about life expectancy, if it varies from 50 to 80, even if, you know, 30 years of extra life expectancy it's not 8/5, it's not 60% more uh, consumption equivalent, even if that translates more, that's still just a lot less variation going from $500 a year consumption to $50,000, or in the United States, $100,000 a year of consumption per capita. So actually, it's more like a per household number. I should have said more closer to 50,000 per capita. But that's still a huge gap. That's a factor of 100 gap in consumption per capita, and even the consumption equivalent of the life expectancy differences are much smaller than that factor of 100.
Okay. And so welfare is still overall welfare is still very highly correlated with GDP, but not necessarily in income and consumption, right?
Um, I mean, do you mean by that consumption and income aren't perfectly correlated? Is that what you mean?
No, I mean, like in the French case, the consumption is significantly lower on a per. I guess it's a per capita basis. It doesn't really matter. Yeah, the consumption is a lot lower, but their welfare is approximately equal to the
Right. Yeah.
U.S.
So if you just took like the richest 35 countries in roughly the OECD, then you're right.
Yeah.
The relationship would be much weaker because then the differences in consumption are smaller, and the differences in these life expectancy and inequality and leisure loom larger. But in the broad cross section of levels of development across the most extreme rich versus the most extreme poor, that's where the consumption differences are coming to dominate, and they're highly correlated with the income differences. But even then, there's economically significant differences between GDP and our measure. So life expectancy is much lower in developing countries. So that makes does the opposite of what the adjustment does in Western Europe, where it makes them closer to the U.S., maybe just as wealthy, just as well off, even though their market GDP and even market consumption is lower. Their overall welfare is much closer to the U.S. If you go to other countries like South Africa, where life expectancy is significantly lower, tons of inequality, that's having a big effect on their relative welfare, consumption equivalent welfare, as we call it, compared to income. So their market GDP might be 20% of US per capita income, but our welfare measure might be below 10%. So it makes a big difference still. Even though it's correlated with GDP, our adjustments aren't trivial.
Hmm. Yeah, so I'll throw something out, Pete, and you can tell me if this makes any sense or you found anything in the data. Um, so one way I might think about this is that when consumption is lower, perhaps inequality is lower, lifespan is higher, happiness in general is higher. Maybe the country is less stressed out for a variety of reasons. So those factors appear to have some relationships. In which case, we may find a group of countries with lower consumption compared to the US, but on parity with welfare. So, sort of what you're finding, right?
I mean, I guess, yeah, like comparing, countries in Western Europe that have a lot more leisure time. If that's what you mean by less stress, they're not working as hard. So they yeah,
Yeah, like you suggested, a country with high inequality in itself is a risky place for people to live in general, and that should have some relationship to stress. Um, but can we? Now, let me ask it differently. Can we equate welfare to happiness in some way?
I mean, our notion of welfare is a subset of the things that we think contribute to happiness. I would say that happiness is a broader concept. So when people do surveys and ask about happiness, that's like a whole separate topic. Can we ask people about their level of happiness, and does that give us a reasonable metric for it? But I think those measures are broader than the measures we're looking at. So I wouldn't equate our four-factor, measure of welfare to all the factors that contribute to happiness, or even the most important ones, right? So uh, yeah, so I think it's a movement towards incorporating things that do matter without necessarily calculating everything that matters.
And so what are the conclusions from this, Pete? So you looked at Western European countries, you looked at some developing countries, and they have different characteristics. So what's the general conclusions from the paper?
The top two I would say is that one is there's more inequality in the world than just in GDP, because among the rich countries, they're doing even better because of the higher life expectancy than, say, developing countries, and they have less inequality. So the world levels of inequality look even bigger. If you look at growth rates, though, one thing that really really stands out, really strikes us, is that you get a lot of growth from rising life expectancy. So we like to take Japan, where people kind of describe the period from 1900 to 2010 or even beyond as lost decades, where the growth rate of GDP was much lower, and therefore the progress in the standard of living had stagnated. But if you look at life expectancy, it rose in a non-trivial way by a couple of years over that time period. And once the quality of life is quite high, which it is in Japan, having by our measures of consumption and hours worked, and once you add years to a very high quality life, that's worth a lot. it's arguably worth more than just raising consumption 1% per year for a decade, is to raise life expectancy by 1 year over that decade, because you're already having a very high quality life. You'd love to have another year as opposed to having yet another TV or yet another car. It'd be great to have another year to enjoy the high standard of living you already enjoy.
But we haven't really seen GDP growth in Japan,
Right.
though, right?
That's the contrast I'm saying, is that our broader welfare measure, Japan doesn't look like a growth disaster at all, because of the rise in life expectancy there has been so valuable. That's the equivalent of like adding 2 percentage points per year to their growth rate.
And so if you measure welfare, you find a higher levels of welfare in Japan, and maybe a growth in welfare.
And so that's one of the key lessons that we take from it, is that rising life expectancy is worth a lot. If we focus on GDP and just don't think about increasing the quantity of life, then we're taking too narrow an approach. And that's just one striking factor in the growth process, is saying, we should care a lot about research into health, avoiding things that reduce life expectancy, and also investing in things that raise life expectancy. We're putting a value on that and saying, look, it's quite high, the progress we've made in life expectancy, to the extent that it's leveled off, for example, in the US in the last 5 to 10 years. That's really bad news for welfare growth. So the fact that GDP growth has kind of held up, okay, since, maybe the last 10 years, the life expectancy data has been pretty discouraging. It stopped increasing for the first time in a long time. So I guess that's the pessimistic sign recently in the US, is that progress in life expectancy seems to have stopped for a while.
Right. I want to go into another paper, Pete. The allocation of talent and US economic growth. You say in 1960, 94% of doctors and lawyers were white men. By 2010, the fraction was just 62%. Similar changes in other highly skilled occupations have occurred throughout the US economy during the last 50 years. So these numbers indicate an improvement, but we are still struggling with it, right? It's nowhere close to parity.
That's right. So, if white males are 40% or less of the occupation, then the population, then it should be 40% of each occupation. Now, maybe not every single last one, in the sense of like, NBA players, might be men disproportionately, that, or 100%, that's fine. But once we're talking about high skilled occupations where, brawn is not really an issue, that's the occupations we're talking about. We're talking about lawyer and doctor, as you said, managers, scientists, and so on. So there, the distribution of talent, we assume in the paper, and we think, all the evidence we're aware of supports this, is the same by gender and by race. And then that means that any difference in outcome is a byproduct of misallocation of talent. So the analogy I like is from the Outliers book. I think it's an Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, where he talks about there's being some bias in Canada, where people who are older for their grade, the people who are the oldest within their grade level, tend to be better at sports because they're older. And so they're disproportionately represented later on the national hockey team. And in a way, imagine, 2/3 of the people on the Canadian hockey team are born in the first 3 months of the year. That means there's a misallocation of talent. There were perfectly talented people born later in the year that weren't guided into sports because people kind of mistakenly saw their lack of performance when they were young as a byproduct of lack of talent, when it was just that they were a little bit younger. So the same thing is going on, we think, if, there's almost all white male doctors in 1960, there's women and African Americans who had all the talent to be fabulous doctors, or instead shunted into other occupations, nurses, laborers, and so on. So that's a misallocation. That's in the same way that the Canadian hockey team is not as good as it could be if it drew in an equal way on the whole population. You could say the medical profession is not served by the best doctors, conditional on the number of doctors we have, because we're not drawing equally on the whole talent pool.
Right. And so that misallocation would have resulted in loss of GDP, loss of economic value for society, and so on. And at the micro level, Pete, one could also look at discrimination practiced in hiring policies at the company level. One could argue that if a company is doing that, the managers of the firm are not really maximizing shareholder value.
Yeah, that's true. If they, and one way to say that would be, if discrimination drives down wages of women and black women, white women, and black men, then for the same jobs, for the same quality of work, then there's opportunities for employers to hire workers who are cheaper and earn more profit. So it's a classic argument of Gary Becker of that competition will reduce discrimination in that way. But one of the things we found in this study was that a lot of the discrimination, or at least more of the progress that we found, that number going from 94 down to 62%. So the declining discrimination we saw was more pre-labor market, was more equalizing to a greater extent opportunities before you even got to the labor market. So if people don't get access to equal investments in health and in education, if schools in predominantly black neighborhoods are not funded as well, if they're underfunded compared to schools in white-dominated neighborhoods, that can lead to underinvestment in human capital, which then means when they hit the labor market, the firms may not say, "Oh, I want to hire workers to the same degree in every occupation," because they have not even gotten the opportunity to go to med school or the opportunity to prepare for college that would get them into a good med school. So even if the labor market had no discrimination at all, unequal opportunities before the labor market can mean there's misallocation of talent ultimately in the occupations later.
Yeah, so if that is true, then Pete, there are two implications. One is obviously initial conditions matter, as you say. And if initial conditions are not at parity, you will always have this problem in the labor market. But if that is true, then we would see a plateau here. If we are not really investing into the initial conditions, we would see this fraction plateauing, right? We are at 62% by 2010. I don't know if we have any latest data where we are today.
It's converged a little bit. It's not at the same rate of progress that it was from 1960 to 2010, but there has been some more convergence in the high-skilled occupation share in, say, 2010 to 2018, which is the latest data we were able to look at. We still think, as you mentioned, there's a lot of room for further progress. So the U.S. can experience more growth from equalizing opportunities, and we think some of the discrimination in the labor market. What I was trying to say earlier was that there can be discrimination before the labor market. And one thing I wanted to stress too is that if everybody was the same, the discrimination might be very unfair and lead to huge inequalities of outcome and decline in welfare. But what we're talking about is actually economic efficiency, meaning how much output you're able to produce. If everybody had the same talent, then it wouldn't matter who was doctors and who was nurses. But because there's heterogeneity in talent, which is what we estimate in every occupation, there's all this heterogeneity in wages, for example. If there's heterogeneity in talent, some people have comparative advantage. They're really good at doctors, and they're maybe only just above average as nurses. So those people who are really good at being doctors should be doctors. Those who are above average, at being doctors, but really good at being nurses should be nurses. So it's that inequality in talent that leads to comparative advantage that means there's actually an efficiency loss from this. So that was part of what was novel about our paper. There's tons of research in economics documenting wage gaps and education gaps that are consistent with discrimination in the labor market and pre-labor market, but we were emphasizing the aggregate output and productivity implications of this discrimination and maybe the growth that we've experienced because the discrimination has declined. But then there's, like you said, tremendous room for further growth from reducing discrimination further.
Yeah, so the primary observation here is that percentage is declining. So you argue that because it's declining, that in itself shows that it was inefficient in 1960s.
Well, we're saying it's the fact that it was different than equal representation of each group in every occupation, every high-skilled occupation, that itself consistent with misallocation under the assumption that talent is equally distributed in all the groups. And so the decline toward a more equal representation is consistent with a less misallocation. So we're saying it looks like there's a lot of misallocation relative to the equal benchmark, and we're not as far from that. So we're not as misallocated. But as you said, we still got room to go. We still got room for more progress in reducing misallocation further.
Right. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk about this and how this might be getting worse in the presence of COVID-19. Thank you. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com. So we are back. Pete, we were talking about welfare that may be driven by the factors that you consider, such as consumption, leisure, mortality, and inequality across countries and across time. And specific to the U.S., how race might have played a role in output. And again, you looked at data from 1960s to all the way to 2010. You have a very recent paper that came out this year entitled Race and Economic Well-Being in the United States. And sort of a combination of the two topics we discussed. You say we construct a measure of consumption equivalent welfare for Black and white Americans from 1984 through 2018. And again, those four factors, expectancy, consumption, leisure, inequality in consumption and leisure, are considered. So this is focused on the U.S. So what do you find in this paper in terms of welfare?
So we wanted to look at both levels of welfare for Black versus white Americans and progress over the period you mentioned. And one thing we were startled with was how low welfare, as we measure it, was for Black Americans in 1984 relative to whites. We estimate 50%, or slightly under that, 49%. And again, that's, as we talked about earlier, that's a measure that incorporates not just lower consumption of market goods and services, but most crucially, lower life expectancy. We also take into account leisure time, which we find modestly higher for Black Americans, although most of that gap, or some of that gap, goes away if we say, wait a minute, some of that's different unemployment rates. Is that really leisure time? And then, of course, there's differences in incarceration, which together mostly eliminate that gap. So leisure we incorporate, but isn't that different on net between Black and white Americans. And we also incorporate inequality, but inequality differences are not large between the two groups either. So ultimately in there, we were surprised that the gap is as large as it is, that it's fully a factor of 2 in their welfare in sorry about that, barking in the background, in 1984. And so part of that's market consumption, and part of it is life expectancy. So even though we have these other terms, they're just not very large, the differences in leisure and inequality. So the difference in life expectancy was like over 5 years in 1984, 5 years higher for white Americans than Black Americans. And so then the next thing we look at is the growth rate, and the gap narrowed so that Black welfare relative to white welfare is closer to 80% in 1984, and equal contributions from rising market consumption for Black versus white Americans, and then equal contribution of a narrowing of that life expectancy gap. And that's partly that it's leveled off. So it's not necessarily good news that it leveled off for white Americans, because some of that's this well-documented deaths of despair, higher rates of suicide, deaths from opioid overdose, and alcohol-related deaths. So those have hit a lot of low education level white Americans and leveled off their life expectancy improvements, but there were significant improvements in Black life expectancy, so that the gap is a couple of years smaller than it used to be. And so we're estimating that's equivalent to something like a 10 percentage point move in their relative welfare in consumption equivalent terms. So combine that with the fact that their market consumption is also about 10 percentage points higher, and we get there, actually it's about more like 15 and 15, because we go from 49 to 79 over that. So it's like 15 percentage points from each of those components. That's the main thing we find in the paper.
So the gap is still quite large, you say, but there has been progress. Doesn't it sort of go back to, from a policy perspective, again, the initial conditions seem to have a huge effect. Life expectancy, for example, my understanding is that Black Americans have a higher level of diseases such as hypertension and type 2 diabetes. Some of it could be equated to diet and stress. And so I wondered, Pete, from a purely looking at how to change the system today, there are a set of policies you could think about, but to make it robust, to go beyond certain levels, it seems to me that the focus really has to be on how the initial conditions are set for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. And I think what we see as the value of quantifying this is that if one's thinking about investments in improving health and maybe prenatal health, maybe postnatal health, maybe school lunch nutrition, all kinds of different dimensions, you can think about investing in improving market outcomes that affect market consumption. It also might affect education, can feed back into health. There's all these different policies that governments can consider. And then rather than just say, well, here's the outcome in terms of wages or earnings, or here's the outcome in terms of life expectancy, to be able to actually think about these relative value in the same units. So we're just trying to say not only here's the progress that's been made and here's the progress that's yet to be made, but also emphasize how you trade off. If we can get big increases in life expectancy through early childhood investments, those may be really high return, taking into account the life expectancy, even if they don't yield very large gains in market earnings.
Right. And I would imagine you could compute some sort of a return on investment metric from a policy perspective. If the government were to invest into making this gap smaller, there will be significant societal benefits. And I would imagine there has to be very high returns on that investment.
Right. I agree. So any government investment you should be able to calculate a rate of return that incorporates a number of factors, incorporates, leisure time, so somebody who works more actually enjoys less leisure time, and that cuts into the welfare gain that additional work actually brings. So a kind of a complete accounting, like an internal rate of return, would incorporate the life expectancy effects, the market consumption effects, but also things like the leisure time and inequality, which you mentioned. Now, there's one key factor which we've touched on that we don't quantify very well. And I'm not an expert in this literature, so I've started to consume a little bit what's out there, but I haven't been able to find what I really want, which is I really want to be able to have a metric for morbidity. You mentioned things like hypertension. So there's some studies, over the time period we want that ask some questions about how much people have limitations on their daily activities of various sorts. The hard thing is finding studies that convert that into dollar equivalents. Like, what would people pay? How much would they sacrifice in terms of their consumption? If I bring my personal example, how much would I sacrifice in my annual consumption to have the same health as I had when I was 20 that I do now when I'm 56? It'd be really nice to know that. I can answer that idiosyncratically for myself, but that's not very helpful. I really want to know how the average person values that. And so that would enable us to have a more complete estimate than we currently do that would incorporate more aspects of the quality of life. But yeah, so what we're really aiming for, taking a step in this paper, is saying if the government has different investments it can make, it should be able to calculate an internal rate of return that incorporates a lot of these factors.
Yeah. The quality of life aspect I think, is quite critical. And I don't think this is in the paper, Pete, but the healthcare aspects of this is, is hugely important from a return perspective again. So there are few disease states like hypertension, type 2 diabetes, that is a big chunk of the healthcare cost of the system. And these are related to nutrition, dietary habits, behavior, and so on. And so any investments that you make into that has very high return for society. But I don't think we have policies in place, that looks at it systematically.
Yeah, I think you're touching on, if I understand you correctly, you're touching on one way in which people might not fully internalize the costs, say if it's in Medicare insurance, of their own health investments and their own health decisions on kind of future fiscal burden on the whole society. So that's one motive for why you'd want government investments to encourage people to make healthier decisions, or to even policies like taxing. I don't know how effective they are. We have to really study this case by case, but things like taxing certain unhealthy foods relative to healthy foods, or just making preventive care and education about health more easily accessible.
Right, exactly. I want to go into one of your recent papers again, trading off consumption and COVID-19 deaths. I don't think this is published yet, but has it been published?
Yes, we published it earlier this year. Yeah.
Okay. And so this is sort of looking at the macro question, right? So you say this note develops a framework for thinking about the following question: what's the maximum amount of consumption that a utilitarian welfare function would be willing to trade off to avoid the deaths associated with COVID-19? And it's a very topical and relevant question. Half the country thinks one way, other half thinks the other way. So we clearly have diversity in opinions in this. So give a little bit of what's the data that you used and what you found.
Yes. So just as you said, we really wanted to know, not that it was feasible, but we really wanted to know how much we'd be willing to sacrifice a year's worth of consumption to avoid, say, we use 0.8% of the population dying from COVID-19. That was based on an estimate that, if over 1% might die who are exposed, but not everybody would be exposed and infected, because herd immunity would be reached at 70% or 75%. So we had a certain death rate of 0.8% for the whole population, and it wasn't uniform. It was important to us. This may sound ghoulish to non-economists, but this is how economists think all the time. It's not neutral to us, who dies, in the sense of, if somebody with 40 years of life expectancy dies, that's like losing 40 years of life. If somebody with 10 years of life expectancy dies, that's like you losing 10 remaining life years. So medical professionals talk about this all the time, quality adjusted life years. That's what we're talking about. We're saying, how many life years do you lose? So we take into account not only the overall mortality rate for the whole population, if we let it run loose completely, if we went to the herd immunity strategy, we say who would die, how many people would die, but also who would die. And so then we say, okay, these are how many life years we lose, and what is a life year worth? And that's obviously really hard to estimate as well, but we use people's behavior. We use how much people are willing to take, for example, higher wage jobs in exchange for something that involves more accident risk and more mortality risk in the job. So that's one estimate. There's other estimates people use, like how much people pay for, how much people are willing to speed even though it's risky, and other risky decisions people make with mortality effects. And that's hard because there could be behavioral considerations. People might not know fully the risks that they're taking, but some of those considerations would mean people are understating the risks that they're facing. So it could be that these estimates are kind of conservative. And so this literature, a typical estimate of this literature might be that 1 year of life is worth, say, $250,000 worth of consumption. And that might seem really high because per capita consumption is only $50,000 a year. But keep in mind that people have all this leisure time, and that what people pay for consumption isn't what it's worth to them, right? This is like, if people are starving, they might be willing to work really hard to avoid starvation. So there might be a lot of surplus that the quality of life together, all we experience, might be worth a lot more than just the market consumption that we enjoy. So put all those things together, it's perfectly plausible that the value of life is the equivalent of $250,000. But the way to think about it is that people are willing to pay in the form of lower wages, lower consumption to have a safer job, or they're able to pay more for a safer car. All those we're converting that into what those life years are worth that are lost. And so then we're borrowing from some of the medical literature about how old typical victims are. A conservative number would be something like 10 years life remaining for a typical victim from COVID-19, but that's an evolving estimate that's moving over time. But because we have to take into account, and we're not experts in this, we're borrowing from other papers, about victims are not only how old are they on average, say there's a victim who's 80 years old, but if they're in a nursing home, they might not have the same life expectancy as the average 80-year-old in the United States. So that tends to shave, according to other people's estimates, a couple years off how much you'd expect an 80-year-old to have in remaining life. The average victim might only have 10 years, whereas the average 80-year-old might live, say, 12 years of life. So we put those estimates together of what a life year is worth. We go a little bit farther because we realize the more we sacrifice consumption to try to avoid these deaths, the more painful that is. And that's not even taking into account inequality. But I've given you kind of an introduction to how we try to come up with an aggregate number of how much we're willing to sacrifice.
Yeah. And so you estimate, if I understand this correctly, Pete, you estimate 41%?
Right. The 41% number is ignoring the fact that it gets more and more painful the more we sacrifice. When we take that into account, it's closer to like 28%. But yeah.
Okay. And so 41% of consumption, 14.7, $15 trillion in consumption. So you say you get about $6 trillion. So approximately $6 trillion is what we are willing to trade off.
Well, we should be. If we value these lives lost, life years lost, like people have typically done according to their behavior, then we should be willing to, if it prevents all these life year loss, sacrifice that much. And then, of course, this is kind of like the trade-off we'd be willing to make, and then policymakers need to think about what options are actually available. Like, how easy would it be to prevent half the deaths, all the deaths, third of the deaths, and so on, in terms of you can picture like a frontier of what's feasible, and then the government would figure out where it would like to be on that frontier.
Right. Yeah. So if 250K holds as the lost value of human life per year, then these numbers, at the very least, is very large.
Right.
Many trillions of dollars. So from a policy perspective, we have to also understand this, that these types of events are, if preventable, the government should be investing very large amounts to prevent them, because the consequences of these are trillions of dollars.
Exactly. Yeah. So right now it looks like GDP in this year may have fallen 5%. And a fuller analysis would take into account the fact that it's very unequal. Some people have had to slash their consumption and earnings much more than that. And in fact, people with lower earnings have tended to be hit much harder than people with higher earnings because of the contact exposure of their occupations. So even taking into account things like equality, say you had like a 10% decline, then you'd have to say, was this a good trade-off we've made so far? Has this been really unwise? So if we take that 0.8% mortality rate and multiply it, that's the average across the whole population. But again, it's very age dependent. If you think about that as meaning we would have lost 2.5 million or more lives, and we're closer to a tenth of that. So we've avoided 90% of the losses, maybe less because as time goes on, that number is increasing. Say we've avoided 80% of the deaths in the end in exchange for lowering GDP 10%, but maybe more because you think about relative to trend, we would have increased. So I was saying GDP declined, but we were on a growth path. So you could easily get to something like, we've spent 15% of GDP to avoid 80% of the deaths. That's been a really good investment. So maybe we should have done more along those lines, which is what you're saying. I think that there's big gains from avoiding these deaths. We're willing to sacrifice a lot.
Right, right. And going back to a welfare framework, the COVID-19 shock would have increased inequality, would have reduced life expectancy. So there are multiple factors that are going to reduce the welfare, right?
Right. Yeah. So it's just a bad shock in terms of, we're either enjoying, less life years, or we're enjoying less market consumption, or some combination. So we've taken a mix of those two. But I was saying, compared to letting her rip, that the economy doesn't suffer at all. If that meant that we had the full 0.8% mortality, that would have been much worse than what we've done so far. And of course, the policy trade-off is trying to figure out, is there ways to mitigate even further the loss in economic activity while maximizing the life savings from it.
Right. And so in conclusion, Pete, given all of this, we talked about discrimination, we talked about things improving but potentially plateauing. We talked about welfare, the factors that might affect welfare. What would you say sort of the major policy directions should be for the U.S. next 5 years?
The next 5 years, maybe I might
Yeah.
want to answer it even longer term, which is, I think this COVID-19 episode emphasizes the importance of technology and research. And I think, that some of the slow growth the United States experiences is due to a slowdown in our investments in research. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity to do more effective research, and partly connecting the topics we've talked about, is that the United States is one of the most innovative countries in the world. And yet the United States and many other countries, there's just not that many women inventors or Black inventors, and in the U.S. population. So we're not tapping all of the talent that we could. That's true of economics. Economics is disproportionately white males, and that means economic research is not as good as it could be, because it's not drawing on the best talent. And so I think there's optimistically, if the world invests more in research in the United States and elsewhere. If you think about, often people frame the rise of China and India as a competitive threat to the United States and to other countries. But there's a win-win element, which is we're seeing here in the case of investments in vaccines that can benefit more than one country. The same logic goes that if a cure for Alzheimer comes from China, that will benefit the whole world. If investments that are made in research in India, there's talent everywhere, wherever it comes from, whether it comes from Africa or Latin America or Asia or Europe or North America, it can benefit the world. So I guess the challenges we're facing, I think research, not necessarily by economists, but maybe commercial research, but also you've seen the pharmaceutical industry just do wonders in the past year. You can imagine just research, basic research by government, but also commercial research is a potential way to improve all of these things. And tapping into a wider pool of talent in the U.S. and the rest of the world is one of the keys to doing that.
Yeah, it's if we can look at the positive side of this, if one can consider to be positive, and that is, your analysis basically says there's a pent-up talent in the country that we haven't really deployed optimally. And so the country is able to do that. We can really go places, even now with the existing resources. And so that's one thing to really think about. It's not, the effect of equalizing opportunities, equalizing or not equalizing, but kind of reducing inequality to zero, if possible, has a significant societal benefit. On the research side, Pete, this is not in the paper. I want to get your perspective very quickly, and that is private research, private companies, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology companies are obviously profit-seeking companies. They get out of certain areas if the economics is not strong enough. And antibacterials is a good example of this. They don't really invest into vaccines. because in normal times, the return on those investments are not very high, maybe, which would then mean that countries, and I'll talk about from a US perspective, there has to be, NIH type organizations who are really looking into basic research that is going to pay off in a shock like the one that we're going through.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned a couple of things there. One, I totally agree with. One is that basic research can be a complement to commercial research later. Like, you can go back in history and see so many examples of that, like solid state physics research feeding into the semiconductor revolution with huge commercial applications. And it's just really hard for commercial entities to see, short run benefits of some of this basic research. And given that the basic research feeds later into these commercial applications, it's a really important complement that the government can fund and should fund. And then the other thing you touched on is, anything that's contagious, the private market won't fully invest in it because the buyers of the products won't have a full incentive to internalize the effects of reducing the contagion on other people. So if people were just asked to pay for vaccines, they might not pay enough for them because they'd only take into account the benefits themselves and their loved ones. So, but also things like bacterial resistance. Any farmer using antibiotics heavily for their livestock is not internalizing fully, I think, the impact of that resistance on the whole population of people as well as animals. So lots of roles for government. As wonderful as markets are, and they've generated this huge prosperity path for much of the world, governments can address imperfections in those markets. So the government's not perfect either, just like markets aren't perfect, but there's an opportunity for evidence-based policy to improve on what markets can do and harness the power of markets to make outcomes even better and fairer and make the world a better place.
Great. Excellent. Yeah. Thanks so much, Pete. Thanks for spending time
You're
with
welcome.
me.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Bye. This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.